What's up, Utes? We're trying something a little bit different this week. We wanted to give you guys the week off because tomorrow, as you know, is Easter. We want you to spend it with your family after coming to church with us and celebrating Jesus' resurrection. But we didn't want this whole holiday to go by without a time where we kind of continue the idea from last week of this grand story that God was writing, and how we were talking about when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the donkey, that even though from the outside that seemed like a really low-key and maybe even a boring entrance, that was the greatest heroic entrance of the greatest hero of all time onto the biggest stage and arena for the greatest showdown that the world, the galaxy, the universe has ever seen. And so I wanted to give you guys a little video here, kind of a continuation of that thought as we're going into the idea of Easter. And I wanted to start out with some questions. Obviously you can't respond back to me, but I want these to be kind of rolling around your head before we jump in. So why do we as humans love storytelling? Why do we love a hero? Why do we love adventure? Why do we love an epic tale that starts in one place and there's ups and downs and then there's this grand conclusion? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, it's honestly kind of weird if you think of it, objectively. Like, we as people like to hear stories about other random people who do things that we'll never do in ways that we can't understand. And we'll sit there for 2 or 3 hours watching a movie, or much longer reading a book, because we draw some inspiration from these stories. And why? I mean, if you notice, there's some elements and themes that are through most of these books, and you would think that would make them boring, right? Most books, you can predict that the good guy's going to win in the end, right? There's going to be a moment where the romance seems to be broken, but the hero at the last moment will save the princess, he will conquer the enemy, and they will live happily ever after. At least most of the stories. And as I was sitting there thinking, like, why do we do this? As I was studying through the Easter story and Jesus's entrance into Jerusalem, I was like, why do we put so much power into these stories? Why are there multi-trillion-dollar industries like Marvel that crank out a movie every year and people want to go watch and follow the storyline, even though you know in the end kind of what the ending is going to be? And the answer to this, as I was studying, is really this idea that we are made in the image of God. You might be like, what does that have to do with our love of storytelling? Well, if you guys remember when we went through Genesis ages and ages ago, it talks about how Adam and Eve were made in the image of God. And that wasn't just the physical characteristics of eyes and a face and walk around, but also in how we're built, what we desire. God was a creator, and so Adam and Eve were creative. God loved beauty, and that's why the world is beautiful, and Adam and Eve then pursued and loved beauty. And in that way, when I say we're made in the image of God, we have a little imprint of God's nature, and that's ours. And so what we are attracted to when we read these stories and these books and these movies is we're seeing elements of who God is and the great story that God is writing, and we feel a connection to it. Even people who don't understand who God is, believe in atheism, that there is no God, they weren't created for a purpose, still draw this power and this inspiration from these works, these great epic stories. And I think to a certain degree, they probably couldn't explain to you why, but we as Christians know it's because of that imprint of who God is on us. We look for God in everything we do. And when we see a story about a great hero, a noble, brilliant, young, smart hero who's going to come in on a covert mission, we began to be inspired because this is what Jesus did. And this is where I'm tying it to the Easter story, is that if you look at the story of the gospel, specifically when we get to the story of Jesus, if you look at his whole life, it's an amazing story that almost every movie, TV show, or book you read is going to knock off in some way. Here are some of the elements that are in this story. Just try to see if you can think of some movies that maybe have these in them. Okay, so as I said before, a young hero, bold, strong, brave, and smart, courageous when he needs to be, gentle when he needs to be, kind to women, a defender of children, a man's man who worked with his hands, who was not afraid of the government, of soldiers, who followed God, or followed, as many would say, his heart, and his heart was set on God, to carry out great missions, one of which was walking into an enemy territory when death was looming overhead. For the sake of his love, which, as we find out later, is the church that he's coming to lay his life down for. So we have a courageous young hero who, because his bride has fallen into sin, is trapped, held bondage to an evil demonic power, comes in to free her, and in the end lays down his life as a sacrifice. But he doesn't stay dead. This is the beauty of Easter, is that he then rises from the dead. Now, hopefully, as you're thinking through those themes, there are tons of movies and shows that come to mind. Some of the most important things to our history as humans are these literature and these books and these poems and these movements, and they all have this same progression. And I think that's amazing. It's showing that what we're attaching to is not just something that we've learned as humans, but something that's innate deep inside us. Fun fact for all you history nerds, the very first book that was ever written, right, all the way, even slightly before the Bible, was called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it was this story about a kind of messy king, but he was the hero of the story, and throughout it he performs all these great deeds, and in the end his greatest mission is he has to go to try to overcome death. He has to defend his city from monsters, from dragons, from beasts. He loses a friend and decides that now he must conquer death. And in the end, in a way, he does. And again, this is now looking forward to Jesus. Even in more recent films, as I was joking, I had you guys watch Hercules last week. If you look at Hercules zoomed out, it's the story of a son of God who is a man as well, and is attempted to be killed when he is a baby, but succeeds in living, carrying out an amazing life of courageous and heroic actions, and in the end, to save the woman he loves, he gives up his strength and his deity, you can see the Jesus elements here, for the love of the woman, the church, the bride, and through it, he then has to sacrifice himself to save her. However, through that sacrifice, he rises again, and the Hades character, which is Satan, he basically backhands into a lake of, as we're going to see in the New Testament eventually, a lake of fire. This idea that Jesus sacrificed himself but arose courageous, a victory, and then he is reunited with his Father in heaven and receives a hero's welcome. And I could go all day about other stories like The Princess Bride, about a character who's supposed to be dead but is not dead, who comes to save his bride from an evil lord. We can even look at Marvel movies like Captain America, a regular man who's willing to give his life for the love of his bride, or his true love in that story, and also to sacrifice himself in the end of the movie for the greater good of the world. However, he's not dead. Even movies like Superman, an alien, so from someone not from our planet, comes to our planet as a child, is like a man, but is different than a man, with a goal and a mission, who will rise up to defend the entire human race, and eventually will give his life to protect us, but is not dead and will rise again. So this beautiful picture, this artful story that God wrote, is really the story that gives all other stories their meaning. And I just wanted to share that with you guys, and I want you to start to grasp this. When you watch a movie and you see, like, why do I feel inspired by this movie? Why do I love watching a romance? So why do we always cheer for the good guy to win and the bad guy to lose? It's because that is a picture of what God already planned for history in the future. And Jesus came as the embodiment of that history, to become the archetype of that story, to show us exactly his plan, his nature, and inside of us, that nature that God has given us reflects that and is drawn to that even when we don't know why. As I tell people all the time, when you see Superman, why Superman is great is because he's like Jesus, not the other way around. When we look at Jesus and think his life was boring or Jesus wasn't a hero, we're missing it. You can't look at another character and say, wow, this is a great hero, because in comparison, they're all just slightly like Jesus. Why those stories of death and resurrection are so powerful is because they're knockoffs. Basically, they draw their power from the fact that there was one hero, the greatest hero of all, who would walk in and for love would lay down his life and then take it back up again. So this Easter, I want this to be floating around your guys' brain, this power, this story, this idea that God has written an enormously grand story, And the cool part is we get to be a part of it now. We get to believe this true story. This inspiration that we get is not from a fake legend or a hero that died, but is from a risen and a living hero that is then giving our lives purpose. And one day we'll get to see that super cool scene of any movie and show when after that hero's died, resurrected, and he comes back to take judgment, and no one can stand in his way because he has come and he's the conquering king. And one day we'll get to see the end of the story, which is where we all live happily ever after with our God, with Jesus, working in perfect community with everyone else. That's all I got for you guys today. Hope you enjoy your Easter. Tell your family you love them. We'll look to see you guys next week at 6.